welcome you, all of you, those that have known, but we've met before, and those that haven't met before. And tonight, as we wrote in the email, I want to dedicate this class to someone some people I'd rather not have dedicated it to, and that is to the Kedoshim, the ones that died simply because they were Jewish, which is now world tragedy in Mumbai, India, namely Gavriel and Rivka Holtzberg, and the other Jews that died in that Chabad house has become famous Nariman house, as they called it. And of course, tragedy for us is not just the Jews that died, but also the people in general, innocent people in the hotels, and for no reason, simply due to the senselessness and the insanity of the world we live in. In truth, I was really struggling whether I should discuss it at all, talk about it. I was in my life, as I wrote last week, is the contrast going on. I just became a grandfather, as I shared with you. And sitting with my new granddaughter and watching A Pure Life. And just the contrast of, I literally landed in LA Friday morning, and I was sitting and writing, and the news had not been really confirmed. What's going on there? You know, every minute, all kinds of conflicting reports. And then when I heard the news, just that unbelievable contrast between life and death. And of course, above all, which was maybe unpredictable or maybe predictable, the outpouring, maybe unprecedented, that the chord that it touched in so many people. I guess due to the brutality of it, due to the fact that it's in India, you know, due to the fact that two people, young 28, 29-year-old couple, who were only there for one reason, not for business and not for pleasure, but literally just there, dedicated to serve others. No political position, so there's nothing like, should have no enemy in the world. On the contrary, they've made only friends, and that they should be so literally executed. That's the right word, and the brutal fashion is something that's beyond words, and it's unfathomable, and it touches a chord on what kind of world we live in. You know, so on one hand, you feel like in a few weeks from now, a few days, everyone's going to go back to life, and the complacency of what they say in Hebrew, "Elam k'minhagi noyeg," which means the world just continues to roll on, will take over. But at the same time, the fact that there is an awakening, even amidst all the other so-called economic crisis and others, which pale in comparison, of course, to something like this, is an opportunity. And Maimonides writes that when a calamity, a catastrophe strikes an individual or a people or a community, it should not be ignored, and it should not be seen as some random thing, an accident. He actually calls it achzaris, he calls it as a cruel thing, if you look at it as just a random event. But we have to look at it as a wake-up call, as an introspection. This doesn't suggest, just to qualify, that we or anybody is to blame for it, but to ignore it and make believe like it happened to somebody else, it's not my problem, is, from a Jewish perspective, profoundly insulting and insensitive. If for nothing else, just the honoring the people that died under such circumstances. So I dedicate it to them and to all they've achieved. And for Jews, we live on through the actions, and I definitely will not spend this evening trying to explain this, just like we don't explain the Holocaust and other things, but I think to really use the opportunity to translate it into how do Jews and how have Jews dealt with things like this through our history, because we're not new to the abyss. You know, I want to begin, if I may. I just happened to be last week, I was talking to an older chassid, and he was describing the difficult times in the Soviet Union. And he said that, something I only know as the stories from my father and my parents who grew up there. Everyone in this room has probably parents or grandparents or great-grandparents that lived in some form of oppression. And he was sharing with me in a very moving way how they would gather secretly in basements, someone's house. They had to all maneuver their way not to be caught, not to be informed upon. And what they had was a farbringen. They would gather together and strengthen each other. And it was the songs and the melodies and the stories, and just sitting together in a way, knowing that they're there for each other, that gave them strength to survive some of the most harshest things. So I happened to ask him if he remembered, this was like 2 weeks ago, a song. So, you talk about singing songs. What songs were sung, particularly that gave him strength? So he sung for me a song which I know from my own childhood. And I thought, based on the statement from the Alter Rebbe, which is the founder of the Chabad movement, these two, the couple that we're talking about, Chabad Chassidim, Chabad Shluchim, the Alter Rebbe once said that when you have a question, you don't have an answer, you tell a story. And if that doesn't work, you sing a song, which means that there are certain questions in life, especially issues of life and death, that we're not going to find rational answers to. But a story, life experience, a real life story on the ground, has a certain power. And then there's the power of a song that's even more powerful than that. So, since everything is divine providence, with your permission, and since I have here some colleagues who may correct me in the way I sing the song, but I'll just ignore that if I may. You're not Mendel, right? I'd like to sing a song which simply, to me, was as I said, divine providence, that he told me the song gave him strength. And the Hasidic melodies particularly, you can't even really call them a song, it's like almost a story itself. If you listen to it, it has a meditative quality, it's like a chant in a way. And they're known, especially these type of melodies, for their depth and the yearning. And not necessarily that the song per se will answer our questions. Maybe they will. But one thing they do give us, they connect us to people who have been here before us. And being that this has been a trauma for so many, especially if you watched yesterday, the funeral, etc. And if you think about the details, maybe better not to think about them. So, as I said, with your permission, I don't know the name of the song, but I'll sing it for you. And then maybe we could just end right there if it's all resolved. If not, I'll tell the story. Oy na na oy de na na no ya na 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 ya na ya no oy de na na ya no ya na 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 ya no oy de ya na ya no ya na ya no oy de na na ya no ya na ya no oy de na na ya no ya na ra ya na oy na ra ya na oy na ra na na ya na ra ya na ya na oy de na na ya no ya na 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 ya na ya na ra na ya no ya na ya na na ya na ya na ra na ya no ya na ra ya no ya na ra na ya no ya na ra na ya no ya de na na ya no ya 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 no ya no ya no ya no ya de na na ya no ya na na ya de na ya de na ya na ro na 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 ya na na ya no ya na ra ya na oy na ra ya na 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 ya na ra ya na ay oy de na na ya no ya na ya na na ya na na ya na ra na ya no ya na ya na na ya na na ya na ra na ya no ya na ra ra ya no ya na ra na na ya no ya ya no ya na na ya no ya So you have here a couple who, as the story goes, 5 years ago picked themselves up. They lived in the community where I grew up in. So though I didn't know them personally, they're younger than I am, but I know many couples like that. And with a sheer enthusiasm and passion, without many questions, almost irrationally, pick themselves up and go to a place called Mumbai, India. And then we have the story that happened a few days ago. As I said, to answer the big question why things like that happen, this is not in the domain of human beings, and it would almost be arrogant and insulting to even try to answer such a question. You know the famous story about the rabbi who was a brilliant scholar, and one of his students came to him once asking a question. His question was, actually no, sorry, I missed the beginning of the story. Pardon. The story was that this rabbi was a very beloved and brilliant rabbi and scholar, and tragedy struck his family. The details were that his family went on a boat, and they all, unfortunately, the boat sank, and they all perished. When the news came back to the town, they were wondering what are they going to tell the rabbi, and who's going to tell him this news? Who wants to break such news on someone? So they finally decided that, you know what, they'll take his Talmud Muvik, as they call it, his favorite student, and this favorite student, let him figure out a way to break the news, to tell his great teacher what had happened. Well, of course, he procrastinated and delayed, and thinking, how is he supposed to present such a thing? And then he thought of an idea. He goes into the Beis Medrash, to the academy where they were studying the yeshiva, and he says to his rabbi, he opens up a Gemara, a Talmud, and he opens it up to a page in the tractate in Brachas, the first tractate in the Talmud, where the statement goes like this, that Keshem, just like a person is obligated to thank God for the blessings, to be mavarach on the blessings, the same thing, a person should bless God and thank God for their clothes, for the curses, for the negative things in their lives. And he says to his teacher, can you explain to me what this means? You know, without telling him what had happened. An academic question. Can you explain to me what this Talmud means? How could they equate the two? I understand everything comes from God, there's some hidden thing, but how could you equate? So of course his rabbi, who was such a scholar, went into a whole elaborate discussion of the different various explanations given, that we don't know God's ways, that even today may not look good, but in the big picture, the Hasidic explanation, you read it Tzarech Aliyah, that every descent brings to a greater ascent, etc., etc. And he continued, but the student would not give up and challenge him. But still, how could you equate the two? So the rabbi went into the next series of explanations. Finally, at the end, the student says to him, so you're telling me that literally there was some catastrophe befall someone, they have to get up and dance and be happy just as if they were dancing at their child's wedding? So the rabbi said, yeah, it's difficult perhaps, but that's what the Talmud is saying. So a student said to him, Rabbi, you can get up and dance. And I told him what happened. So of course, instead of dancing, the great rabbi fainted. And when he came, when they revived him, he came to that he said, suddenly I don't understand this entire Talmud myself. Because till now it was an academic discussion. And academic discussions are very nice. You can philosophize and pontificate. But when the person experiences it, it's a different story. And this in essence is really both the most profound answer. God forbid somebody sitting Shiva experienced a loss. As smart as you are, you don't go and start trying to explain to them why it's not so bad. Or why everybody else is suffering. And, I remember when I sat Shiva for my father, Le'aleinu, no one should know of this. So, there were people, the inexperienced ones, were trying to give me all kinds of explanations and telling me how there are bigger tragedies. It doesn't make you feel better. The people who were able to console were those that can look in your eyes and not say a word. And not be uncomfortable with death. I remember the first day we came back from the funeral. I'll never forget it. The people that came to my house, and the first day, many people avoid going, whatever. First people that came were all those that lost their fathers. Young people, at young age. And they didn't say a word. They just knew how to hug you, and they looked at you. And frankly, it doesn't even matter. At that stage, you're not looking for words. There's some power in communion. And as I said, a brilliant mind cannot speak to a bleeding heart. It's a different language. Which is perhaps why the Alter Rebbe said a song has its own power, it speaks to the heart. Story. So, as this story illustrates, with the rabbi, the Jews always knew, as it was when Aaron's sons were torn away from him in their youth and in their height. Vayidem Aaron was silent. Silence is the classical answer, but not silence out of weakness. When the 10 martyrs that we pray about and we tell their story in Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, when they were massacred, and the most brutal possible way by the Roman Empire, were decided that they have to pay for the crime of their ancestors, the tribes who sold Joseph. So it's an unbelievably dramatic story how Rabbi Shmuel, the high priest, come together with the rest of the group and they say, what do we do? They say, well, we got to go up to heaven and find out if this decree is divine or not. Do we accept it or do we resist? And the story goes how Rabbi Shmuel goes up to heaven, basically a spiritual experience, and he asks in the cryptic language of this prayer. He asks the man dressed in white, and he tells him, sadly, that I heard from behind the curtain that yes, this gzeira, this decree was passed. And Kabla Aleichem, he says, accepted upon you, this is what God chose to do. And then they were massacred, the greatest of the generation, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel, Kohen Gadol, the whole list, 10 martyrs. So the angels and Moses came crying to God and said, why? Is this the Torah and is this reward? This is a question so many have asked about this massacre. Here, 2 people, couple, with a little boy, have enough tzaras as it is, and here they went only for one reason, to spread light, and so every death is senseless, every murder is senseless, but some of them are just that are glaringly impossible to understand. If there's a God, it's like, what is God watching? Now, is this a bigger question than the Holocaust itself? I'm not suggesting it is, but it's the question of our time right now. So it just brings up all the questions of history. That doesn't make the questions less just because we've had it before. So how do Jews look at such a thing? So we're not afraid to ask the question, and we're not afraid to have chutzpah even and challenge God. But also, here's the other side of it. God's response. Ishtaik kachalu b'machshava, this silence. Be silent. So when you think about it, what kind of answer is that? And it's documented for history, posterity, that God, when he was asked the big question, the biggest question of all, he says, be quiet. What is God pulling rank? Threatening? No. And it's not that God said, don't ask such questions. The question is repeated by them, and before that, when Abraham, even praying for a wicked city of Sodom, he challenges God in the most profound way, saying that people will say that the judge of the universe doesn't do justice. We're talking about the wicked Sodom, but he said maybe there's a few righteous people in the city. And Moses, points an accusing finger at God when Pharaoh was bathing in the blood of Jewish children. So Moses says at the end of the first chapter in Exodus, he says, Lama hireisa la'am hazeh. He doesn't say to God, why do you allow Pharaoh to do evil? Why do you allow Hitler to kill? He says, Lama hireisa. He says to God, why do you do evil to these people? Because Moses cut through all the smoke screens. There's a God in this universe. Who's running the show here? You're allowing Pharaoh. Is not just, it means that God in some way, he accused God. Now it's true that Moses was reprimanded afterwards. That God said to Moses, the forefathers, patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never asked me such a question. But it's interesting, even when God, so to speak, reprimands Moses, he then responds. He reveals to him deeper secrets about God's presence that the forefathers didn't hear. So these are the greatest people of faith, challenging God in the most profound way. Not as some people think faith is some passive experience, where you just accept, God said so, okay. We just accept it, which seems, really a person of faith shouldn't second guess God. Why do we pray, for instance, when someone, God forbid, is sick in the hospital, someone is not well? We say Rifayinu in the prayers, and we make Misha Berachs. You hear Rotzins, all kinds of prayers and blessings and psalms. Why do we do all that? If we're people of faith, we should this is God's decree. We don't understand it. God knows better, whatever. We're told clearly that faith is not an act of passive acceptance. Faith is a partnership. The faith we have in a divine being is not just of a master and a servant, of a one-way street. It's a partnership. God created a universe, gave us a mandate to transform this cruel world into a good place, and we're partners. So we have a right to ask. When something doesn't seem good, we have a right to say, why is it not good? Why do we deserve this? So faith is not passivity, would be a sign of indifference. That's not faith. Faith is an act. It's a constant relationship. If you argue with someone you love, that's not lack of love, that's a sign of love. That means you care. I'm talking about an argument, a healthy one. You challenge something that you find disturbing in the big plan, where God said that this world should be a better place, and we're doing our best and things don't work. We not only should, we must demand. But then there's another side to it, and that is that there's a mystery to existence, and that's the silence. The silence is not silence that God is silencing us. It's an important distinction, because today's day and age, as some of you may know, one of the big problems I've always encountered is that religion is associated with closed-mindedness. Someone asks questions in school, just challenging you. The teacher said, you're not allowed to ask questions. We don't ask questions, accept. And I personally have witnessed and seen the damage done to many people who came away in their teenage years saying, that's Judaism. Basically a cult. You ask any questions, it's unacceptable. In other words, only if you toe the line. And damage has been done. Well, I can tell you the Judaism I grew up with, both in my home and the environment around the Rebbe, same Rebbe that these emissaries represented in Mumbai, was that questioning is a sacred duty and part of the relationship. If God didn't want us to ask questions, He wouldn't give us minds. We may have to expand. Okay. Not like somebody told me God gave us minds to shut them off and not use them. God wouldn't have given us minds. We would just accept everything blindly. And the Torah, you see clearly, the Torah is about thinking and understanding. The adaita, to know, to understand, to appreciate. So a relationship requires a two-way street. But then, as I said, there's the second half. And the second half is that we don't, if we're intelligent people, we have very little amount of knowledge about existence in general, about matters of life and death for sure, even about ourselves. I think I shared with you the statistic, unscientific survey that I did, where I asked around 100 people, maybe a little less, ranging from 10 years old to 90 years old, from 1 to 100, with 100 being 100%, how much do you know about yourself? So if 100% would mean I know everything about myself, complete self-awareness. And without fail, I ask both boys and girls, men and women, and religious, not religious, Jewish or not Jewish, everyone, the statistic was always consistent. The younger the age, the higher the percentage. So, like a 15-year-old said something like 70% I know, and by the time I'm 40, I'll probably know like 90% about myself. And you ask the 40-year-old, the number is reversed. And you ask the 90-year-old, check it out, test it yourself. A 90-year-old said to me, maybe 1%. I don't even know that amount. So what's going on here? As you get older, you know less about yourself. The answer is, as you climb the mountain of life, and you see broader horizons, you see also how little you know. So it's because of your wisdom, because of your gaining of knowledge. And this is just about our own self-awareness, let alone the cosmos. So this is not a justification, God forbid. As I said, this doesn't contradict the first half of the statement that we are required to have a communication with God. With God as a father, a mother, a child is allowed, not allowed, is expected to be able to come to a parent and cry and say why. And then there's the second half, which I said is not a contradiction. The second half is a profound awareness that there's a bigger picture. And this is not an answer, but rather just an awareness, acknowledgement. And that's the silence. God is basically saying the deepest secrets of life cannot be spoken. Think about it in a very most basic level. The most intimate part of yourself, you'll find you have the fewest words to express, which seems a little weird. Why? Because talk about superficial things in life, like the weather, sports. You can talk about it all day. You know, every time you get into an elevator, guaranteed. I test it all the time. In an elevator, how's the weather today? It's a perfect conversation. And if the elevator was a long ride, people could talk about the weather, and then last week's weather, and under the weather, and before, and all the different levels of weather. Then there's talk radio, it's called, right? When it comes to talk about yourself and the things that matter most to you, you'll find you have very few words. And not because you don't trust to share with even the people you trust, if you have any people like that. You find it's very difficult to really express. And the deeper you go, the less words. Why is that? The answer is because words are containers. And containers, like all containers, have parameters. There's only that much water you can fill a cup with. So words, being limited containers, can only express that many feelings. So we create a language called metaphor. Poetry, music, song, art. It's a language that's also language. Because it's metaphorical and because it's less tangible, more abstract, it contains deeper energy. And then there's a language that cannot even be captured. There's an expression, feelings that can't even be expressed, even metaphor, only in a cry. Oy vey. If you say it properly, oy vey can capture the tsaras, the problems of generations, of thousands of years. It could be a cry of joy, a cry of pain. And then there's something even deeper. There's a state where even a cry is too limiting of a container. You'll see people, God forbid, in deep shock, they can't even cry. Getting them to cry is actually considered to be very therapeutic in early stages, so there should be some release. Real shock, there's not even a cry. In a positive side of it, the Zohar says there's a thing called kola delo yishtama. Talking about shofar. So shofar has each sound of the shofar itself has different levels of crying, really. A form of crying. But then there's a sound that has no sound. And that is the expression of the deepest part of a soul. The most intimate part of a human being's soul, of anything truly real, doesn't have words. It doesn't have words, not because there's something to hide, it's just simply uncontainable in words. The people you truly love in the deepest way, yes, there's ways to express love. A hug, a kiss, words, you can say I love you. You can through actions. But the actual love itself comes from a place that's beyond all those expressions. And then those expressions follow. When the Jews left Egypt, So they were very thankful, of course. And they said to God, well, we're ready now to receive your mitzvahs, your commandments, your laws. And God said to them, interestingly, he said, the Medrash says, Mechilta said, God said, Kablu malchusei v'achakach kablu gzeresei. First accept me, my sovereignty, my being, just that I exist. And then you'll accept what I ask of you. The lessons of that, on every level possible, are unbelievably profound in what commitment truly is. All the way down to psychological lessons and lessons in relationships. If you accept somebody in their entirety, you obviously will follow that. You'll follow what they ask you, that you'll comply to what they ask you to do. If you don't accept someone, then you can comply with every detail. It doesn't mean you're really complying. It means you're following the letter. You do that in a business contract. An agreement's an agreement. You're an ethical person. You follow what you agreed. Even then, as we all know, people dispute. Why? Because there's no real love or relationship between two entities. It's a mutual benefit, so there's a contract to sign. God didn't want a contract with the Jewish people. He wanted a relationship. You accept me, my being, and my mystery, and that which is unknowable. And then we'll talk about the mitzvahs. And actually, when we say Shema, and V'hayim Shema, those two prayers, the Shema that yesterday was cried out, if you've seen the funeral, so, it was almost impossible to even watch the father of Rivka, Holtzberg. Rosenberg is her maiden name. He said the Shema, a father's a father. The Shema was a declaration of Jews in best of times, but also in the worst of times. They said at the times when they went to the stake, and it was their documents that document the fact that Jews said it even in going to the gas chamber. So you say to yourself, going to the gas chambers, he's saying Shema, you should be arguing with God then. You should be denying God, and many did. What's the saying Shema? What kind of, and you're talking about intelligent Jews here, not some narrow-minded cultish followers. So there was a Holocaust survivor who tells the story that there was a colleague of his, a friend of his, and they were brutally torturing him before the Nazis shot him. And right before they were about to kill him, the Jew said to the Nazi, "Can I say something?" So he said, "Okay." He thought he was going to say something to him. No, he started muttering something, mumbling something. So the Nazi said, "What are you saying?" He's saying, "I'm thanking God." And the Nazi in his way said, "What are you thanking God for? You're about to be killed." He says, "I'm thanking God that He didn't create me like you." I know it's funny, but it's not so funny. Yeah, that person's grandchildren live today and they know who he is. The Nazis I don't know about. But Shema was not some simple type of denial, escapism. It was a profound statement that people were saying that even if you take my body, you can't take my soul. That even if you do whatever you can, if it won't be this generation, it will be the next. And if it won't be my children, it will be my grandchildren. And look today, 60 years after the Holocaust, the miraculous Renaissance, people, flesh and blood, you can meet them. What strength, where do they get that strength? Impossible to understand. But it comes from a very profound and silent relationship. It's a place of silence. There's no words. And it reminds me when Job, well, it reminds me, I wasn't there, but I read about it. So I read about it in the book of Job. When Job, the classic sufferer and the big book of all the questions of why, all the questions we ask are all there in that book. So Job asks, of course, among his different questions, asks God about the issues of life and death and righteousness and why wicked prosper and the good suffer. Classic timeless questions. And there's one verse there that always, for some reason that verse always gets me, because it so resonates. God says to him, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact wording. God says to him, "You ask me about life, about death, why there's death. You ask me why there's life. Were you there when I created it all? That you asked me these questions?" Essentially, not my explanation at least, maybe it's the commentaries there. That God is saying to him, you ask me why there's death, you ask me why there's life, you ask me why there's an end, you ask me why there's birth. See, we ask the questions when things don't go right. How many of us ask a question why we were born? we take it for granted, or we consider it to be the mysteries that we'll never understand. But when things don't go right, we do ask. And I'm not suggesting, as I said earlier, we have a right to ask, and we should ask because it's part of our obligation, part of our relationship. But you have to think of the big picture as well. Because the mystery of death is directly linked to the mystery of birth. If there was no birth, there'd be no death. If there was no life and no existence, there'd be none of what we suffer. So the real question is, why is it here in the first place? This is clearly a cruel world. I discussed last week, they call it, the Hasidim call it the Alma de Shikra. It's a deceptive world. Now, I just read, I never heard it before, Eli Wiesel, who was a friend of our family. So I asked him yesterday to write a few words in Yiddish about the Mumbai. I thought a person like him, after what he went through. So he started his article in Yiddish. He says about the Vayeitzei Barditchev, where it would say, "Was hetzach in the rishes dicke Welt," which is strange for Vayeitzei Barditchev to say, which means what's going on in the cruel world. So it's a cruel world. There's no doubt about that. Cruelty doesn't always mean that you see cruelty. Cruelty is that there's always a potential for cruelty. That's cruel enough. So when you look at that, the real question is not why the cruel things happen. Why was a universe of this in the first place put into place that has such potential? So here, let's talk about this week's Torah chapter. And it's interesting when you read it. It is exactly the story of these this young couple that went to a distant land. So the story tells, Vayeitzei Yaakov mi Beersheva. Jacob left the city called Beersheva, the city now in Israel as well, in the Negev, southern part of Israel. Beersheva. Beersheva was the home of Abraham, and then later Isaac and Rebekah. And Jacob, for different reasons, running from escaping his brother, looking for a shidduch, goes off. So it starts, Vayeitzei Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Harana. He left the city of Beersheva and went to Harana. The word Harana has a meaning. In Hebrew, every name, every word has meaning. The word Harana means wrath, place of wrath. Charain in Hebrew is anger, wrath, referring to the wrath of God. It was a sinful city. It was a bad city, so to speak. And where did he leave from? He left from Beersheva, which was a very pure place. The word Beersheva also has a meaning. It means the fountain of seven. There were 7 fountains. I'll get back to that in a moment. And then the story continues in graphic detail about this journey of his, which is itself attracts attention because there are many journeys in the Torah. I mean, actually, the whole Torah is about journeys. Yet not every journey is documented. The 42 journeys of the Jews in the wilderness is documented. But there are many journeys that you just know generally. Even Lech Lecha of Abraham, the first of all journeys, when Abraham said, leave your homeland. He leaves southern Iraq to go to Israel. So you only know that aspect, that he left. But you have 1 or 2 verses, and now next step is in Israel. Here, you have a complete detailed story, how Jacob leaves, and then he lies down to go to sleep, falls asleep, and has a dream, the famous dream of the angels climbing up and down and up the ladder. And he wakes up, etc., and he's afraid to continue the journey, asks God for protection. God protects him and blesses him. And then finally he comes to his destination, the story with the fountain, where he meets his future wife, Rachel. And then the story continues of how Laban, his future father-in-law, tortures him basically, and oppresses him with all his corrupt and wily ways to labor. As Jacob later will say, for 20 years I labored, I didn't taste a minute of sleep. And these 20 years that he spent in Haran were very difficult, harsh years. But the end of the story is a happy one. That he builds his family there. Not only does Jacob marry, but all his children, except one child, Benjamin, his last youngest child, who was born later in Israel. And the story of the chapter ends where he returns back home. In this first few verses here, you have, as the Orach Chaim says, a lesson of life. Why are we told this story? It's especially if you look at last week's chapter. It already said in last week's chapter that Jacob left his home and went to Haran. Why is it repeated? So the Orach Chaim, classic commentary, some say he wrote his commentary actually for his daughters. So he writes that this first verse is referring to the descent of the soul into a body. That each of us goes on the same journey as Jacob. Jacob basically is the soul of each person. And it's a journey that goes from a fountain of 7 to a cruel world. What is the fountain of 7? So as Chassidus explains, 7, some of you may be familiar with the 7 spheres. Counting the Omer, we count this 49 days, 7 times 7, 7 days of the week. 7 is a universal number that refers to the 7 dimensions, say 7 building blocks. On a cosmic level, on a personal level, it's essentially the building blocks of the structure of existence. All souls derive from these 7 levels. As a matter of fact, when you say about the menorah that was lit in the temple, the menorah had 7 branches. Each branch represented another one of the divine emotions: chesed, love, gvura, discipline. The teferes is compassion. Netzach, chayd, yisod, malchus, which is ambition, humility, bonding, and dignity. And each of our souls, every one of you in this room, and every one of us, originates from one of these branches. Some originate from the Chesed branch, from the Gvura branch. Obviously, it's not so black and white because all the 7 include the 7. So you can imagine it gets a little more complicated. But people have different tendencies. These are certain personality features. So when we say souls, all souls come from the fountain of 7, which on the spiritual level of the world of Atzilus, the highest world of the 4 spiritual worlds, which is not, we won't discuss that right now, I've discussed it in previous classes. From there, a soul enters into the realm called the material, physical realm of our universe, where Charana dominates, wrath, a place of wrath. And not just divine wrath. It's a cruel world. It's a difficult world. As I discussed last week, just the mere fact that human beings can hurt each other tells you that it's a cruel world. How is it possible? If we're all part of one large organism, connected by a divine source, how is it possible that the right hand can hit the left hand? The only answer is because we don't feel it. Who feels that the whole universe and every human being on this earth is all part of you? And when one person hurts, you're hurting. You talk about a neshama klolis, this type of all-encompassing souls of tzaddikim. The Rebbe, that's a unique thing. So the mere fact that we can live our life, each of us, in our own self, driven by self-interest, itself is the root of all cruelty. That doesn't mean we're all cruel people. It just means we're all potentially cruel. And there's a certain cruelty to the fact that when there's pain in one part of the world, another part doesn't feel. That itself is that indifference. I remember reading when Abe Rosenthal wrote. He was a journalist, a young journalist from the New York Times, and he wrote one of the first dispatches coming out after the camps were freed, concentration camps. And it's one of the most moving articles you'll ever read. He writes about going in one of the, I'm not sure which extermination camp, Birkenau or Auschwitz, which is part of it. And he writes how he sees, he saw the death, he could smell the death. But then he writes the description of the nature of the grass that was growing, and of the indifference of nature, that the grass is growing here as if nothing happened, when the earth is being saturated with so much blood. And the way he describes how the universe itself can become, sometimes it's our best friend and sometimes it's our most cruel partner, because it can be there. The sun can rise, and the sky is beautiful, and the birds chirp, even when there's disaster all around. Why is nature not protesting? Maybe that's why Moses, before he passed away, he declared, who did he make witnesses? He said, Hazino Shamayim, V'sishma Aretz. He made heaven and earth witness. You're a witness to what I will say here today, because the same heaven and earth that was in the time of Moses is the same sky and land that we see today. The same moon, the same sun. So nature has both been a witness to the worst, and maybe gives us hope in that sense, because it's prevailed and survived, but it's also been a silent witness, and it absorbs and allows. So there's a certain concept of a universe that conceals what's really going on beneath. For us it's natural to be duplicitous. You can say one thing and feel another. Echad v'pechad v'leh. But it's not the case for newborn children. Children don't lie on their own. They lie when they learn to lie from adults. So the concept of a seamless world is to us a foreign thing. It makes sense, and you can cry about it. But the world is a cruel world, even before cruelty actually happens in it. Which is really the great downfall when we talk about the root of all evil. So from a Kabbalistic and Hasidic perspective, it all goes back to when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge. And what happened was there was a schism was created. What you see is no longer what you get. The concept, what we call seamlessness. Imagine that what is in your deepest, most intimate recesses of your soul are expressed to the outer world, and vice versa. That inner beauty and outer beauty should be one seamless extension. So it resonates with all of us. We'd love to see such a world, but it's not something that is actualized. This is what happened. There was a split. To use an expression more contemporary, a split between matter and energy. Today, we're beginning to realize matter and energy are reversible. But this was always known to great mystics, that the universe is essentially divine energy, except we only see the outer surface. Now this may sound esoteric, but in truth this is the root of, in a way, of all problems, the concealment, the profound concealment of the divine. Now when you see massacres like we just witnessed, you say, what is this pontification about, as I mentioned before, about esoteric discussions, about the concealment? The bottom line is, innocent people, leaving a young orphan, were brutally tortured and massacred, etc. So what does it all have to do? But the fact is, as I said earlier, what Jews learned, and I guess this maybe is their greatest contribution to society, is that, as the saying goes, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. They learned that you can look death in the face and not be destroyed. And even if, God forbid, the time comes when somebody's body may be taken, the soul never is. This doesn't justify anything, but the strength of that is impossible to defeat, and it was never defeated by anyone, because you cannot destroy soul, you can only destroy bodies. If you put all your eggs in that basket of the material world, then that's the end. The story, some of you may know the Friedrich Rebbe, and I'm mentioning these Rebbes intentionally tonight, because if you want to understand what drives that couple, and what drives so many people, and what will drive all of us to be able to survive even the most difficult circumstances, it comes from certain strengths. So the previous Rebbe, who was not a stranger to pain and suffering, his whole life was around that. He, of course, rises to be a Rebbe in, what year? The year 1920. Now, if you look in history, 1920 was the beginning of the most darkest chapter in all of history. It was right after the Russian Revolution, World War I. The communist Bolsheviks were just coming into power. Stalin would be coming into power a few years later. Hitler a few years after that. And the rest is history, as they say. In the Soviet Union, which is a less known chapter because Nazis' atrocities were so much more obvious. Stalin was not less of a murderer, he just didn't document it. There it was not done with numbers. Russians have different ways of killing. But Stalin, they say, killed who knows how many, 30 million, 40 million, no one even knows. Including all the famine and so on. And of course Jews were always the target. And this is not a long time ago, we're talking about the 20th century here. So 1927, this Rebbe was arrested, because one of the opiate of the masses is religion, Judaism above all. And of course the worst enemies of the Jews were Jews themselves. They're called the Jewish communists, the Yevsekstia they called them. Anyway, this Rebbe was arrested because he was seen as a threat, because his indomitable spirit did not allow in any way to retreat, to compromise, nothing. The Rebbe was adamant that he was going to march forward and do whatever is possible. Now this was not a small thing. One Rebbe, Chassidim, he had a lot of Chassidim, but there were a lot more Russians, the government. So they arrested him. Now being arrested then was not like some type of due process was going to take place. Arrest means you could be shot in a moment. It made no difference. Confession, no confession. So the Rebbe writes in his diary, which he actually calls the Tractate from Hell, Masechet Gehenna, a tractate from hell. He documents what happened. It's in detail. It's been translated in English as well. So he writes many things, and one of the things he writes that he made a decision that he b'shumei, in no way will he compromise anything, because the moment he compromises anything in this place, his spirit, he felt all will be lost. He chose to do things like speak Yiddish, even though he was fluent in Russian, and all kinds of other things. He wanted to pray. He wants his tefillin. Now you're talking about, like almost the thing. First of all, even halachically, you're talking about the threat of death. These mitzvahs it's actually a mitzvah not to do a mitzvah if it's just a threat to your death, except for 3 cardinal sins. But he insisted because this was what he felt was necessary. So one of his captors, Jewish, speaking Yiddish, said to him, pointed a gun to his head. Listen to the story. It's been told many times, but it's an unbelievable story because it was a real story. It's not just a nice cliche or a bumper sticker. He points a gun to his head and says, Rebbe, this little thing here, whatever word he used, has made many people cooperate. And the Rebbe looked at him and said to him, this tzatzke, which in the Yiddish is Russian, is a toy. This toy can frighten only someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds. Or maybe he said 2 worlds. Think about what he said. And this was the Rebbe was exactly trying to embrace death. Jews never embrace death. They do whatever is possible. Chai behem, we live. The Torah is meant for us to live by, not to die by. But that's what he said to him. And at the end there, this Jew, Bader, who was a Jew himself, said to him, Rebbe, we'll see at the end who's going to prevail, you or I. And the Rebbe said, yeah, we'll see. Who prevailed? So he was shot at the end, and the Rebbe, miraculously, was freed. Not that he didn't pay the price, he was hurt and wounded and tortured, and ultimately left Russia, ended up in Europe, and ultimately came to New York, and he established the community which raised the Holtzbergs, Crown Heights. So he came to the United States in 1940 in a wheelchair, physically broken, you can say, but not spiritual. Now he gets off, I just want to tell you this side, under the end of the story. He cuts to America off a wheelchair. There are pictures of it, off the boat. And they take him to the Greystone Hotel in Manhattan. It still exists somewhere. And he wants to say a few words as he comes down the soil of America. And then he gets up, he speaks. I don't know how many people were in the room, 20 people, 30 people. How many could there have been? And the Rebbe speaks in this fashion. He says, he came to America not to save his life. If it was up to him, he wouldn't have come here. He came here because God led him here. And he came to make an announcement that America is not different. That the passion and the commitment and the faith that we had in the old world can be brought here. Because the big thing was America was different. Anyone escaping, and many of you here are probably children or grandchildren from the first emigration due to the pogroms in the Eastern Europe, first emigration. So it was a given. You come off the boat, America's a new world. Here, there are retirement accounts, there are parnosa. It was a different world. And the Rebbe said he came here to demonstrate that that's not the case. And he adamantly insisted the following. He said, we will change this country into a place of Torah, where children will be running around with yarmulkes and tzitzis, and there'll be keeping Shabbos and kosher, and it'll be a renaissance of Jewish life basically. Now listen to what happened next. There's a man in a wheelchair who had gone through, many of his Chassidim were killed. The rest were still in Russia or in Europe, and who knows where they were or where they'll end up. No money, no language, nothing. He didn't come here like the corporate American. He was embraced. They say they didn't have money for a set of silverware. That's the poverty, the Rebbe himself. So a group of his chassidim came into the Rebbe to see him afterwards, and this is what they tell him. Chassidim, this is the Rebbe's so-called followers. Rebbe, with all due respect, I'm just paraphrasing, but more or less what they said was, we heard what you have to say, but the respect of you and your holy parents and holy grandparents and holy great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, we don't want you to heighten your expectations too high, because that's not what's going to happen here. It's, they basically was saying that the Rebbe is living in some illusion. The Rebbe writes in his diary that after they left his room, he says, you can imagine the tears that dropped from my eyes the first night I was on American soil. From what? This is my friend speaking to me, my chassidim, the people who are supposed to follow. They're clarifying. But you see, it made no difference whether this was statistically correct that he had followers or not, or that he had the money, but he knew that Jewish survival was never based on material gain. And today there are 4,000 Chabad Shluchim all over the world. These would not have been had the Rebbe not made that statement, had he not been that adamant, had he not taught that's the way, and then of course his son-in-law who followed in that same passionate fashion. So what you have here is a core essence. Now, what with all the suffering? How did he deal with the suffering? The answer is, and this is what Jews always know, the biggest secret. As I said before, we absolutely have all the chutzpah to challenge God, and we do. At the same time, we have to remember that there are secrets and mysteries that will always remain silent. But above all, and this is the bottom line of all, and this is what happens here, the story of Jacob, is that God says to him that I will bless you. Doesn't give him answers to everything. You are going into a cruel world, he says, but I will bless you and give you the strength that if you hold on to me, I will make sure you'll survive it all. What the secret was, that when you get the fury and the rage and the blood, the boiling anger, when you hear what happened in Mumbai, or for that matter, every time you read a story about the Holocaust, and imagine the humiliation, I mean, I don't even have the words, and you want to do something about it. So you don't find any Jews ever went to become suicide bombers to blow up cafes in Germany. And this is a rule of history. You show me a country that was destroyed by another empire, as soon as they came to power, tell me what was the first thing they did. Consistently, from the beginning of the first empires, Assyrian empires and the Egyptian empire, the first thing was vengeance. Now you did that, now we take care of it. Always vengeance. What the Jews did was channel all the anger and the fury, not passivity and not the complacency. You channel it all into a revolution of good and of light. I've been listening to different commentary about what was going on in the aftermath of Noah. I think it was Marvin Heyer, the only one that had the guts to say the way it was, the way it is actually. He gave a talk in the memorial service in Chabad in California. And he said very clearly that Nazism of the 21st century is the Muslim world. He didn't make any qualifications. The terrorists. He said simply this: Julius Streicher and Goebbels and Eichmann never killed one Jew. But they created a climate where Jews could be killed. And as such, they were criminals of crimes against humanity, just like they were the ones who did the shooting. The climate created, and this is, I know politically incorrect, is in the Muslim world. I'd like to know which moderate Muslim country or leader or imam came out with a protest. I haven't seen any. Maybe there's someone mumbled something somewhere, but even I mean, it amazes me because just from diplomatic point of view, just to fake it, I don't even feel they have to fake it. To me, it's unbelievable. So I'm not suggesting every Muslim is a direct terrorist, but it's a clearly where's the climate, and he said it without apologetics and so on and so forth. You want to rebut this? Send me an email. But the point of the matter is, it happens to be true, and this is not Israel. So even in Israel, it became more acceptable, as he put it, Heyer put it. So grievances, and we Jews don't have grievances. Because you have grievances, so what? So then you go ahead and kill innocent people? Do you have grievances? Like I remember I did a Yom Kippur service a few years ago in Santa Monica. We had like a discussion after the service between Musaf and Mincha, the break we take. So we're talking then, it was right after, I think, it was right after September 11th actually. So I remember a woman got up who insisted that we're to blame, all that whole stuff. So I remember there was a guy in the audience, his name, a good friend of mine, Peter Himmelman, who has a good sense of humor. So he got up, they didn't know who he was. I mean, some people knew, but this woman didn't know, and he says, I absolutely agree with this young lady here. I think the solution to all our problems is we have to bring all the angry Muslims who've been humiliated by the Ottoman Empire to New York and California and send them to our therapists. We should talk about their mothers and their fathers, and we should, instead of throwing down bombs, we should throw down some flowers all over the Middle East. And this woman, she says, that's right, I like that guy. Now he was, of course, kidding. The point is that I'm not here to make a political statement. It's not my forte, but I will say that you have to call a spade, and until the governments of this world, who are terrified of calling this a religious war, are terrified of saying what I just said for a simple reason, because then you're dealing with a war against 1.5, not million, billion Muslims, and that nobody wants to engage something like that. Now again, I'm not suggesting, I know Muslims personally that are absolutely against something like this, but they won't say anything, because it's a climate. It's a climate, and the bar keeps lowering to the point of, and really makes no difference. Who cares what group it came from? Everyone knows more or less that this is an environment, a breeding ground for stuff like this. So that's one half of the story. But on our end, what we can do, and this is the bottom line, practically what we can do, is after everything is said and done, it's about taking a lot of anger, if you have the anger, and a lot of the pain, and channeling it. That's what it comes down to. Simple as that. Today I was talking to one of the people working in my office, who's design stuff, and she told me she's traumatized. She went to this memorial service, she's watching the news, and you hear all the details. They get very gory and very disturbing. And I'll tell you the honest, thank God I was blessed. I sat in the shadow, not the shadow, I sat by the feet of a great giant, the Rebbe himself, who was the son-in-law of the Rebbe I mentioned before, and had suffered plenty in his life too. He was also born 1902 in the Tsarist Russia, and was in Berlin when the Nazis came to power, and France when they occupied, Paris when they occupied France, etc., etc. Saw his share. Brother killed by the Nazis, family killed. And I witnessed personally how a man single-handedly did not allow the complacency of the prosperity of America to get to him, or to anyone, and literally felt like he was fighting a war. Every painful experience, whether it was the losses of the 6-Day War, or you may remember the massacre of Ma'alot. In Ma'alot, there was the northern Israel, terrorists broke into a school. They massacred how many? 20-some kids there. Everything he transformed into a major campaign. The Ma'alot turned into a campaign of mezuzahs on every door. 6-Day War turned into a campaign for putting on tefillin. The Yom Kippur War was a campaign for some of the other campaign mitzvahs, lighting candles, etc. And I saw every time he experienced a loss himself, his mother passed away in 1965, turned it into a major effort to a revolutionary new commentary on Rashi. His wife passed away. His father-in-law passed away. Never, not one loss remained unanswered. And Jonathan Sachs, I think, said it best. He said it in a talk he gave right after Gimel Thomas. He said like this: he always wondered why the Rebbe would spend so many resources to send a Jew, a chas, a shliach, to the farthest ends of the world. What, to bring a matzah to somebody, to put on tefillin, to light a candle? It doesn't seem like a logical use of resources. If you're a businessman, where do you send? You go fishing where the fish are. New York, London, Paris, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Moscow. The places of the world, you have millions of Jews. To send somebody all the way there just to find one Jew. And what Sachs said, he says, speculated, no one knows what goes on in a Rebbe's mind. And listen, it's critical because this couple in Mumbai were part of that philosophy. How many Jews are in Mumbai? A few thousand. So he speculated, he said that he thinks the answer lies in the Holocaust. What happened during the Holocaust? The Nazis, like never in history before, hunted down every Jew with profound hatred. You know the odds, the extent they went. Stethoscopes in walls to find someone hiding in a wall. I mean, that's like an obsession, an unbelievable obsession. The Rebbe felt that if you don't hunt down in love every single Jew with the same and more powerful passion than hunting down the Nazis had in hunting them down with hate, they will have won. And that he could not accept. So it became an obsession in the positive. In other words, for every thrust in the negative, an equal and even stronger thrust in the other side is the only answer. This is not dismissing who's to blame and what has to be done on that level. That's why I mentioned it. And it's not dismissing the big questions we have to God, and doesn't take away the pain. But with the pain, you also do that, because if not, the pain wins. Now, of course, this is driven by profound faith and belief in that good will prevail. Because if you don't have that, why would you fight? Which is often what happens to people. We become paralyzed. And that was also unacceptable. Paralysis is another effect. And that Jewish pride was never allowed to succumb to any of such failure. This is the story, you go through every story from Egypt, from Abraham for that matter. Egypt, the destruction of the first temple, Babylonians, the second temple, all the crusades and the inquisitions and the pogroms and the Holocaust. You'll see this consistent theme. Doesn't mean that everybody came out with that type of power. You know, some people were paralyzed and some people were destroyed. But remember, in a marathon, all you need is one person to continue running with the baton. And we're here. That's the testimony that there are those that did know how to channel it. I'm always amazed. Look at any commentary. Just go to any Jewish library, and look at the writings of the Jews, people of the book. Writings and writings and writings. Here, I have a Chumash here, so everyone knows the classic commentator is Rashi. Okay. Now you read Rashi, you'll see beautiful commentary explaining simply verse by verse. Now you'd think that Rashi was living, if you read his commentary, well, it must have been, on some type of beachfront property, in a very calm environment, and he's writing this beautiful commentary. He was living in France, in the hardest of times, the Middle Ages. Rivers were filled, they said, with more Jewish blood than water. As was Ramban, Nachmanides, as was many of his colleagues, the Bali Tesvis and so on. And you don't see one hint. Today, if someone wrote a book, you can know immediately how dysfunctional his mother is, and his father, and every grievance and every little stupid thing that happened to his entire life. And when they deconstruct literature today, you figure out everybody's life story. I'd like to see, if you deconstruct Rashi, you'll think he was living in bliss, like in heaven. Where did they have such presence? And when I talk about a commentary, a few pages, you're talking about thousands and thousands of pages. You know what kind of concentration you need for that. So I have no doubt that it was coming from the same place. He wasn't writing Rashi commentary because he had nothing to do with himself, or because he was trying to hit the bestseller list, or something like that. It was because the suffering around him propelled him to leave a document that would transform the way we learn Chumash. It was nothing less than revolutionary. And revolution is always driven by passion. It doesn't come from complacency. There the passion was the crisis and the fires that burned around. Now, I never asked Rashi this. I'm not sure whether he would say this, but you see it consistently. Where did it come from? And the same thing drove every one of your parents and grandparents in one way or another. Obviously, our leaders are necessary because without them, we can become overwhelmed. So you go back to the story of Jacob. Great Jacob is terrified. That's what he basically says. He says, I am afraid where I'm going. And God, he waits, he makes a vow that God promised him that I will protect you. And every detail of this story, as I said, is the story of every soul coming down to earth, but it's also the story of every shliach of Chabad that has been now become such a household name, of a couple that lived in Beersheba, relatively speaking, in the comforts of Crown Heights, or Israel, or wherever it is that the fountains of seven, the comforts, and picked themselves up and went to Harana. So it's true, India per se is not a country, anti-Semitic country, which is one of the shocking things. A country that was historically always so kind to Jews, well, definitely not anti-Semitic. But still, Harana in many ways, from a perspective of Jewish spirituality, a place of very far from, called spiritual oasis. And they unfortunately fell into the black hole of the darkness of this world. Again, explanations, I'm not here to give you any of them. But I am a firm believer, and what I was taught, and I think this is something the most important of all things. Every one of us is obligated literally, to do something with the equal amount of passion, more than, not just equal, more than what we have witnessed. And if you are angry, great, channel it, use it, do something, initiate something. I mentioned a few weeks ago, we have this new space here. I invite you all now, and I not only invite, now I insist. Let's make classes here. Anyone who wants to study, start a new Torah class, a group. You have here the space, and I'll provide for you the teacher. So you have no excuses. You just need to designate time. Now, I say it with adamance like this. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I've never told anybody what to do. But I don't want you to tell me what to do either, It goes two ways. But I think in times like this, we have to sometimes be a little less formal and a little more candid. And I do think that we are all obligated, absolutely, if nothing else, to honor people, the Jews that were killed, simply because they were Jews. That's all. There's no other reason. And if you get to the details of it, it gets extremely painful to hear what was done. So I suggest, and you can take any suggestion you like. There are people doing different things. Some have taken upon themselves to influence 10 other people to light candles. Shabbos, Hanukkah is coming up, obviously. Anything that is a permanent commitment, obviously, will immortalize, because we'll always be in the honor of these souls. So their death and pain, we believe, is temporary. Though it's quite painful now, and there's a little child that is not going to forget so easily, even if some of us do. But what we commit to, that can be forever, and it's positive. And I think this is the key thing that we must do in a time like this. Literally. There's so much darkness, you have to have at least, if not more, amount of light. And this can be any type of commitment. I suggest that the studying is definitely a good one, whether it's lighting a candle or a flame, whether it's giving some extra charity. I do want to mention, because some of you asked me, there is a fund that was created for the orphan and for the Mumbai community. If anybody is interested in contributing, you can speak to me afterwards. I'll tell you how to do that. Me or Velvel, if you like. Correct, that's right, I'm sorry. Yeah. There's 2 surviving children. One's in a hospital in Israel. Yeah. Yeah. And but anything that has a permanent type of commitment is obviously. Now this may sound obvious in the sense, I'm not saying anything new. So first of all, who cares if it's new or not new? The fact is, unfortunately, what happened here was new, and it's not going to take away necessarily what happened, but the big picture, it definitely does. And above all, it does it for ourselves, because I'll tell you this. Pain in the world is, as the Kabbalists like to say, is microcosm, macrocosm. All pain is connected. Sometimes it takes on such a global impact, but it's also in our own personal lives. We also have this challenge. What do you do with the challenges you personally have? Many of us have a lot of anger. Many of us have a lot of pain, a lot of loneliness. And the same antidote that I just suggested with the Mumbai massacre is also in our own personal lives. You have to take control of your life. If not, your life will be controlled by something else. There's really no third option. Who's controlling? It's either going to be your negativity, your negative energy, your anger, your losses, your past grievances, etc., or you're going to take control. That's really what it comes down to. So it's not just a small matter. Okay, for every dark thing we do a mitzvah. That's correct too, but it's much more powerful than that. You take initiative, because the worst thing of all is the paralysis, is the sense of lack of control, sense of vulnerability. Is that the word? That we all feel, and the only way to correct that is to become leaders. So what we should take upon ourselves, I think it should be everyone. B'makim shali b'chafetz. You have to find something that's up your alley. But I think I see the awakening. I see really unprecedented. I was pretty surprised. Something touched everyone. Again, I'm not interested in analyzing. It doesn't really matter. And when there's such a touch, when people are touched, it's absolutely critical to turn into something. And it's going to be more difficult than a week or two from now. So now's the time to take on the resolution. Not out of guilt, but simply out of first of all, respect and honor, and above all, of demonstrating what really wins. Now, as I said earlier, I just was in L.A. watching a new life come into this world. So, of course, for every 2 deaths in this world, there's 3 lives that are born, and I'm sure that last time I saw a child like with my own children, and we have some personal subjective feeling when you see your own child, but to me it was symbolic of something. And I was watching, obviously, with that contrasting feelings of what I saw. I saw a little child coming into this world, and so many others, into a world that is not a very pleasant one. But the purity of a child is so unbelievable, and it brings you back to this chapter where Vayeitzei Yaakov, you come from a Be'er Sheva. So I don't know if you, last time you looked at a little child, but each of you here were once little babies, including me, completely vulnerable, held in someone's arms. What goes on in the mind of such a child is very impossible to know. Sometimes you think that they're laughing at us, like what do you think, But it's such an interesting contrast. You think, when do you lose that innocence? And in the light of the events around us, I think one thing we should not ever resign ourselves into feeling that the way the universe is now is healthy. When you look at these children, newborn children, and think of yourself that you were once that place, and maybe that's why we're so drawn to the beauty of a child, is that that's the more natural place. And Jews also always knew that. One of the most beautiful things I always see when about the Rebbe was, despite all the brilliance and sophistication and all the complexity, really at heart there was a certain pure innocence. Really, that's what it came down to. And you saw when the Rebbe was with children, a type of innocence. And I want to say is that I think in times when, dark times especially, it's critical not to lose that. Because it's the easiest thing to lose. You become cynical, jaded, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That type of attitude. Obviously, an attitude like that doesn't help remedy the situation. So I speak about it personally for myself, but maybe it's a good idea, if you have your own young children, obviously maybe spend a few more minutes looking at them this evening. And if not, maybe find a nephew or a niece or someone out there to remind you a little of a pure world. And just on a personal note, I felt I wanted to share that. Finally, I want to say is that, my father passed away 3 years ago, lost his parents, or I wouldn't say lost, my mother likes to say, when people say, oh, I'm sorry that you lost your husband, she always says, I didn't lose him, I know exactly where he is. So my father's parents passed away when he was 20 years old. His parents were pretty young. I'm the namesake of my father's father. My father rarely spoke about that. But especially since my father passed away, I learned much, things that were like non-spoken, that I understand today that I never understood. My father was a very driven person. He was very passionate and dedicated to the things he stood for. He was a journalist, but he saw it as a cause. And now that I think back, I have no doubt, because I saw how he identified in his own way with the Rebbe and with that whole darkness of the world that they came from, which was Stalin's Russia, basically. And these are people, he was not the only one, that learned in some mysterious way to channel the darkest things into powerful forces. Sadly, we live in a world today where many of us have friends that don't know how to do that, even parents. So I want to say it's critical, absolutely, because I see, above all, it's not just what you do, it's the influences around you. And I always say this, look at your Rolodex of the people that you constantly are in contact with, and see how many of them, go through them, and see how many of them, if you call them tonight or tomorrow and say you were inspired, will make sure to remind you with a good splash of cold water, don't get too serious and don't get too inspired. You know, they like to remind you of the miserable life that we live in. And how many that you talk to, every time you leave their presence, they make you feel empowered. Don't underestimate the influence of our social circles. Often we hang around with people who keep reinforcing negative feelings and imagery and does not empower you. And then you wonder, why do I feel so disempowered? It's sometimes just you choose your friends. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody's friends are that way, but I find this, and I just discovered actually in the last few years, that this is a big, big issue that you can really easily address. Hang around people that are empowering, that when you speak to them, you feel, after the end of the conversation, stronger. You feel more confident in yourself. You feel that you have something unique to contribute. I was blessed with people like that in my life. You know, I see the Holtzbergers and the story that they lived. I saw their parents speaking. I saw what they were blessed with. These are driving forces that shape people and change everything. People like that have the confidence to forge ahead. You know, I wish I live up to it, and I don't want to compare, but ultimately, this is one of the profound lessons when you think about why a couple would pick themselves up and go to some distant land. And happily so. You see the videos, you see the reactions. I just read Telushkin's article today, you know, his time that he spent in India. It's amazing, the impact that people have, you know, the beauty. So that's ultimately what we have to perpetuate, and that's yet another lesson. So I want to wish everybody, you know, first of all of the Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, everywhere in the world, should be safe, and God should protect them as He promised Jacob, and gave them the blessing of Ufaratzta Yama V'Kemu, meaning that your children will spread east to west and north to south, and the blessing was fulfilled, and you are that blessing, all of you here, and myself, the Jews, from Haidu Ad Kush, you know, from India all the way to Ethiopia, and north and south, and east and west. Jews are everywhere in the world today, so God should protect them as He promised. And these black holes that, unfortunately, the Holtzbergs fell into, and 6 million Jews fell into a few years ago, should finally be closed by the only one that has the power to close them. But we continue to run the marathon. You are given the baton. And no matter how small you think you are, there's something indispensable you can contribute that no one but you can contribute. That's the bottom line lesson. And as I said, either you're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Either you will be influenced and be controlled by other forces, or you will control them. And that choice is ours, and ours alone. And it takes friends, it takes other people sometimes to give us that support. So look at me as a friend of yours, and hopefully you can empower me, and I can empower you. And and just to get rid of any excuses, if you don't know what type of mitzvah or good deed to take upon yourself in light of all that happened, I'll be happy to suggest a few. So you can't get off the hook that easily. So I want to again wish, first of all, even though the family not here, to the Holtzberg family, they have much that they're going to have to deal with. As we're told, when you suffer and you mourn, that the hole opens up in your living room, in your heart, and the hole doesn't go away. What happens is, with time, you learn to walk around it and not fall into it. So they should be blessed with the strength, and hopefully this awakening, which I've seen is like a unity among many communities and groups that usually don't always get along, should really last, but that's going to have to take some effort on our part. So if a small group like us in this room can become initiators, not just observant Jews, observing from the sidelines, that is, but initiators, and not allow yourself to be overcome by other forces, I think we can create a ripple effect. And again, if anybody wants to contribute to this fund that was created, I'll be happy to tell you how, as well as Velvel, and some announcements. Okay. So again, I dedicate this class to the Ilay Nishmas, the holy people, the holy souls of Rivka and Gavriel Holtzberg, and the other few Jews that were killed in that building, or few, and the hundreds of other innocent souls. And I also want to say that, repeat again, if anybody wants to study, if you want to, whether one-on-one or in small groups, be happy to provide the time, space, and some teachers as well. So you can see me or Velvel again. Velvel, where's Velvel? Wave, wherever you are. Good. And again, just to tell you, tomorrow night, Philip, my good friend Philip, will be giving his regular Thursday class here. He's going to cover some of these things in his own way, creative way. It's called Creative Spirituality. Philip is very unique and is very powerful, those of you that have attended. And for the 20-somethings, my own dear son will also be here a little later tomorrow evening. I think 9. Philip is 7 o'clock, he's at 9. And Hanukkah, we're going to be doing a Hanukkah thing, which will be again in the same spirit, changing the theme to transforming darkness into light, which is the theme of Hanukkah. God should bless everybody. That's December 25th, Thursday night. It'll be like a whole drumming and Hanukkah menorah lighting, but not frivolous, in the spirit of transforming the passions into passions of light. That's the thing. That will be Thursday night. And if there's special group rates and so on, if anyone's interested, again, talk to me at the Velvel. Let's put it that way too much. And I want to finally say a concluding note, in this month of Kislev, which is the month of light, Hanukkah, the Ramban, Nachmanides, writes that these flames shall never be extinguished, suggesting that the flames in the temple were extinguished because the menorah no longer burns in the holy temple. But these flames, Hanukkah flames, never extinguished. Not through all the generations of the darkness of the Middle Ages, the modern ages. So Hanukkah has this obviously particular lesson, a message of inextinguishable spirit of the Jewish people in general, and by extension bringing it to the entire world, because ultimately, as I said, this isn't just a Jewish tragedy, it's a humanitarian. So God should bless us all privately, individually, and communally, only with simchas. Amen. And we should turn it into unbelievable revolution for good and for light. Amen. Everyone have a good night. Until next Wednesday night. Thank you.